In our country, there are many issues that citizens blow their tops over, but one of the hottest of these is whether or not the minimum wage should stay the same. As many of these issues seem to show, most of those involved in the debate seem to think that whatever they are proposing, whether it be to raise the minimum wage or keep it, is a clear-cut, obvious choice. However, this is not the case. Like all choices, the decision to raise or keep the minimum wage will have negative repercussions along with positive ones. Therefore, we shall examine each option and the positive and negative implications of them so that we can make an informed, strong stand on the issue.
Since it is important to wholly understand this topic before making a decision on it, we will discuss the history and background of minimum wage in the United States. The federal minimum wage was first put in place by the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, on June 25, 1938 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Fair Labor Standards Act banned oppressive child labor and set the minimum hourly wage at 25 cents and the maximum work week at 44 hours. At that time of its creation, the Fair Labor Standards Act only applied to about 20% of the labor force. Today, it covers about 84% of the labor force, and the minimum wage is set at $7.25 an hour. Since its inception, the federal minimum wage rate has been raised 22 times. States can also set their own minimum wage rates, but if it is lower than the federal rate applies. As of January 1st, 2017, 29 states and the District of Columbia have higher minimum wage rates than the federal rate. New Mexico, Massachusetts, Washington State, and Washington, D.C. have minimum wages of $7.50, $11, and $12.50 respectively. 2 states currently have minimum wage rates that are lower than the federal rate. 5 states have no minimum wage rates, and 14 states have minimum wage rates that equal the federal minimum wage rate. Certain traits have been found to repeat in minimum wage earners. About 700,000 people earn the federal rate of the minimum wage. If minimum wage earners are broken down into age groups, we see that the age group with the largest number of people who earn the federal rate of minimum wage is 40.9%. 64.3% of women earn the minimum wage versus 35.7% of men. More part-time workers than full-time workers earn the minimum wage, and the largest group of people who earn the minimum wage are those that work in service occupations, particularly the food preparation. For educational attainment characteristics, the percentage of minimum wage earners with solely high school diplomas is 31%. 27.5% of individuals with some college experience and 11.4% of those with bachelor's degrees or higher earn the minimum wage. As stated previously, the federal minimum wage rate has been raised 22 times since its inception in 1938, with the most recent increase to $7.25 in 2007. Many debates have been sparked over whether the minimum wage rate should be increased, with many believing it should be raised to $15. We will now go into more depth on these topics and explain the different points of view of what should be done about the federal minimum wage to increase it or to keep it the same.
In recent years, there's been some debate on either raising the minimum wage or getting rid of it altogether. The supporters of increasing the minimum wage believe that this is the only way to fight poverty in our nation, but many studies have shown that most of these methods actually do the opposite. By increasing the minimum wage, there would be an increase in job loss, and the negative effects on lower-skilled workers would also increase, which causes reverse effects on helping the poor and could introduce higher prices for consumers, which in turn would hurt the nation's economy as a whole. Society has been led to believe that raising the minimum wage will actually help people out of poverty, but this just isn't true. Usually when politicians say that they will raise the minimum wage, it is a tool to gain the votes of the people. What really happens when minimum wage is raised actually negatively affects the poor. This is because when employers or businesses are faced with higher wages, they will not want to pay for the young, unskilled workers to do the jobs. This would eliminate minimum wage workers from the workforce. In addition, higher wages would also entice businesses to increase the price level for the goods they sell. So, for many people who are living in poverty and don't work, it would put them at an even lower position on the social spectrum. If the minimum wage is increased, it will lower incentives for higher education. When students are given a job that pays well, their incentive to continue their education is decreased. In 2009, a study done by the Journal of Economics and Sociology in Maryland found that a 25-cent increase in wages led to a 0.55 dropout rate of neighboring high schools. This just proves how raising the minimum wage would harm the education system and its students. Along with negatively affecting lower-skilled workers, raising the minimum wage would hurt not only small businesses but large companies as well. With the raised prices for paying for workers, small businesses would have to raise the price level of their goods, which would direct consumers to another businesses to buy their goods. Along with negatively affecting lower-skilled workers, raising the minimum wage would not only hurt small businesses but large companies as well. With the raised prices for paying for workers, small businesses would have to raise the price levels of their goods, which would direct consumers to another business to buy their goods. In the end, a vast majority of small businesses would be forced to close due to them not being able to keep up with the demands of lofty price levels and wages. A study done by Duke University has found that 40% of CFOs from multiple companies agree that if the minimum wage was to increase to $10 an hour, they would have to reduce employee benefits in order to pay for their salaries. Another study done by Paul Stitch, who is a professor at Duke University too, discovered that 70% of CFOs would move production overseas if the minimum wage went up $10 an hour. Finally, the minimum wage should not be increased because the proposed plans are too drastic and could hurt the entire macroeconomy in this regard. For example, in 2004, President Obama proposed raising the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10 an hour would be an increase of nearly 40%. That is a huge increase, but still, the proposal is rather conservative for those aiming to raise the minimum wage. Many are calling for it to be raised to $15 an hour, an increase of over 100%. If we were to implement any of these proposals, they could cause major problems in our economy, simply because there's too much change in a relatively short time span. If we were to increase the minimum wage little by little, it would give time for businesses, their employees, and the entire macroeconomy to adjust. However, if we were to increase it by too large of a percentage, all components of a macroeconomy would have to scramble to adjust to new changes. And if they did not do so in time, that would cause a major recession. Unless proposed changes are more moderate, they pose a danger to our economy.
There's a movement in cities across the country to raise the minimum wage to $15 per hour. One of the most prominent advocates is former Labor Secretary Robert Reich, who thinks that $15 per hour should be the minimum wage for the entire country. This is a bad idea. Here are 3 reasons why. First of all, it would kill jobs. One of the basic lessons of economics is that when the price of something goes up, people buy less of it. So, if the price of pumpkin lattes rises, you can expect consumers to buy fewer of them. This law of demand also affects the market for low-skilled workers. Raising the minimum wage means a higher cost of employing each worker, which makes workers less affordable than before. Our coffee shop won't keep a worker at the mandated $15 per hour if that worker's efforts only result in $7.25 per hour in added revenue. Over the course of a year, a shop that keeps such a worker full-time would lose $15,500. So instead, it will eliminate that job. And evidence shows that employers in fact do respond in this way to minimum wage hikes. Recent research by economists Jeffrey Clemens and Michael Wither finds that 1.4 million jobs were destroyed in the late 2000s when the minimum wage rose across all 50 states by an average of nearly 30%. And worse, those job losses were probably suffered by the people who need jobs the most. This fact brings us to reason number 2. The minimum wage actually hurts the people we most want to help. When the minimum wage rises, the workers fired first and the ones hired last are those who employers judge to be the least productive. The inner-city teen from the lousy school district or the immigrant with poor English will be fired before the suburban American teen from the excellent school district. So those who are most disadvantaged tend to suffer the most job losses. This reality is compounded by the fact that raising the minimum wage causes more competition for jobs. A supermarket job that once paid $8 per hour draws more applicants when it pays $15 per hour. Applicants who include retirees and people with higher education who re-enter the workforce only because of the higher wage. Because these people often have more skills, they squeeze out immigrants and those from disadvantaged backgrounds who are likely more desperate for the jobs and certainly more desperate to gain job experience. The third reason is that minimum wage hikes aren't necessary to give deserving workers raises. 96% of American workers today earn wages higher than the current minimum wage, which proves that employers don't just pay the minimum that they're obliged to pay by law. Employers respond to the value that each employee adds so they can retain the best talent. It's expensive to train new employees, and businesses don't want to lose good workers to their competitors. So they raise worker pay voluntarily as employees gain more skills and experience. But when government imposes such raises by hiking the minimum wage, some of the least experienced workers will not only lose their current jobs, they'll find it incredibly hard to find other jobs. In essence, the minimum wage cuts off the first rung on the employment ladder, and it's that first, lowest paying rung that provides the skills and experience workers need to reach the next rung and to continue climbing their way to a better life.
Even though there are great reasons to keep the minimum wage constant, there are also some great reasons why it shouldn't remain constant. Primarily, the minimum wage is under the living wage. In other words, people who earn the minimum wage, and only the minimum wage, do not earn enough to afford the basic necessities of living, such as adequate food and housing. For people with minimum skills, this is obviously a problem. Therefore, it is important to consider raising the minimum wage and its effects. Increasing the minimum wage to $15 will affect a large portion of the United States' workers. As shown by this graph, the percentage of workers that are affected by minimum wage has stayed relatively stable since the turn of the century. However, by increasing the wage, it will cause a spike in the effect that minimum wage has on U.S. workers. Assuming that the idea of raising minimum wage to $15 is put into effect, the red line represents a drastic spike in the effect on U.S. workers. This jump in wage could affect anywhere from 21 to 50% of all workers, whether it be through pay cuts or larger payouts. This is not the only effect that raising the wage will have. By increasing the wage to $15, this will be more than double the current federal minimum wage of $7.25. This plan to raise the wage by such a great amount was introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders. He calls it the Pay Workers a Living Wage Act, which entitles increasing the minimum wage annually until it reaches the goal of $15 per hour by 2021. Along with Bernie, 2 states have already agreed to raise their state wages to the same amount, those states being California and New York, along with the District of Columbia. Along with these important reasons that the minimum wage should be increased, Robert Reich, a political commentator and professor, further explains in detail why the minimum wage should be increased in this brief video.
Democrats are getting ready for a major push to raise the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour. Now, that's better than nothing, but it is not enough. The minimum wage should be raised to $15 incrementally over the next 3 years. Here are 7 reasons why. 1. Had the minimum wage of 1968 been adjusted for inflation, it would be well above $10 an hour today. But the typical worker today is also more than twice as productive as then. Adjusted for both inflation and productivity gains, therefore, the minimum wage should be at least $15 an hour. 2. $10.10 an hour is not enough to lift all workers and their families out of poverty. This is especially true for millions of low-wage workers who want full-time jobs but can only work and find part-time work. Most low-wage workers are not teenagers. They're major breadwinners for their families. 3. Because some employers now pay wages that don't lift their employees out of poverty, the rest of us pay for their Medicaid, food stamps, housing, and other assistance, in effect subsidizing these low-wage employers. Some, like McDonald's, actually advise their employees to use public programs because their pay is just too low. 4. Some jobs may be lost if the minimum is raised to $15, but many more people will be lifted out of poverty. And because low-wage workers will have more money to spend, their spending will create many more jobs. 5. Such a wage increase is more likely to come out of profits than be passed on in higher prices, because most employers of low-wage workers are in intense competition for customers. 6. Since Republicans will no doubt try to push Democrats to go even lower than their $10.10 proposal, it's doubly important to be clear about what's right in the first place. Democrats should be talking about a bigger increase, not listening to Republican demands for a smaller one. 7, and finally, at a time in our nation's history when 95% of all economic gains are going to the top 1%, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour isn't just smart economics, it's the right thing to do.
Professor Reese does a very good job at explaining why the minimum wage should be increased to $15. However, one of the things he did not touch on is the effect that the increase will have on low-wage workers as a whole. There are just about 41 million workers at the minimum wage level in the United States. That's roughly 30% of the entire working population. By increasing their pay to $15 per hour, this will significantly increase their income. While all of these benefits sound great for those low-income workers, Congress has yet to implement such a plan where minimum wage would be increased to the desired $15. Over past years, they have decreased to the minimum wage. They've kept the minimum wage exactly where it is. Here are some reasons why.
Since raising the minimum wage might not be the best idea, keeping the minimum wage might indeed be the most optimal decision. There are two major reasons why this is the case. The first of these is that the current minimum wage is a compromise between protecting the interests of workers and the interests of businesses. For businesses, not increasing the minimum wage is beneficial because it will not force greater cost on employers, ones that they will not be able to earn back. For them, keeping the minimum wage where it is would keep costs sustainably low. On the other hand, the minimum wage is necessary to have for the sake of vulnerable workers. Without it, they would be financially exploited by their employers. For the workers, keeping the minimum wage means protecting their interests. Perhaps it does not seem like an ideal solution for either party, but neither is raising the minimum wage. It is impossible to completely satisfy both laborers and employers in regards to this issue. So if we cannot completely satisfy everyone, we can at least compromise and make sure that all parties get some satisfaction. Inversely, minimum wage has not been hurting our economy as is. The last major problem that our economy faced was the economic recession of 2008. The recession was caused by problems in the financial markets and real estate markets, of which the amount of the minimum wage had nothing to do with. The fact of the matter is that the minimum wage is currently working. It is a good idea not to fix the minimum wage when it is not broken, especially considering that we just came out of a recession. Raising the minimum wage has obvious benefits, such as putting a more sustainable amount of money in workers' pockets. However, an increase also has clear risks, such as raising business costs and worker layoffs, as well as potentially harmful effects on the macroeconomy. Likewise, keeping the minimum wage constant has benefits, such as keeping a stable compromise between workers and businesses. However, a constant minimum wage would also keep low-wage workers impoverished. It is with these considerations that we, as a group, have decided to keep a constant minimum wage. While the benefits of raising the minimum wage sound more appealing than the benefits of keeping it the same, the negative effects of a wage raise are much more dangerous than those of a constant wage. These dangerous effects of a raised minimum wage are enough to rule out the benefits. Therefore, we have decided that keeping a constant minimum wage is the most optimal choice for our economy.